October 1944, Eastern approaches to Samar just after first light. The sea ran a greasy pewter under low cloud, oil sheens rainbowing between whitecaps, as Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato and her sisters, bracketed by cruiser lines and a scythe of destroyers, cleared the San Bernardino Strait at battle speed. The night's currents had been kind. The charts promised only stragglers and slow transports beyond. Then the sky contradicted the ink. Lookouts on foremast platforms shouted, hands cutting at the clouds, and Kurita's bridge glass filled with specks that swelled into angular, blunt-nosed shapes. Bomb racks flashed, folding wings locked wide, and the first FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers came down in chopping angles that ignored every Japanese gunnery drill. Officers reached for recognition books out of habit and found no answer that explained why. Carrier planes were here when no American fleet carriers were, plotted within striking range. At ZO 700, the first, torpedo tracks scribbled pale on the swell, forcing heavy cruisers to heel hard and throw white water off their bows. Tone's mounts hammered skyward. Yamato's 127mm mounts added sheets of flak. Destroyers laced the air with 25mm fire. Reports bled across the radio net in broken bursts. Attackers circling, diving, climbing again. No steady direction. No lull to reset target solution. Some bridges swore Zeros had risen somewhere to meet them. More sober logs noted only ship-launched float planes and the futility of their arcs under the American swarm. By 08:30, damage messages stacked faster than they could be sorted. Hit on Chokai. Fires amidships on Suzuya. Near misses drumming Nagato's plates, while the enemy kept arriving from empty horizon, as if the sea itself minted aircraft. "Baby carriers," someone muttered with contempt that sounded too much like fear. By 0900, smoke columns marked the path behind the force, and helmsmen were fighting both the swell and their own uncertainty, because nothing in the operational plan accounted for escort carriers flinging sorties in relentless relays. The question spread faster than any order. Where were these planes coming from, and how could auxiliaries force the pride of the combined fleet to stagger? The answer lay just beyond the rain squalls with a handful of thin-skinned decks and understrength air groups. Taffy task. Units that now prepared their next strikes, while their escorts ran at the enemy. In the years before Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it was destined to rule the Pacific as Britain had once ruled the Atlantic. From its birth in the late 19th century, Japan's naval command had absorbed the gospel of Alfred Thayer Mahan, that empires rose or fell on sea power, and sea power was built on great fleets of decisive battleships. Every officer trained at Itajima understood the doctrine: draw the enemy across the ocean, weaken him through attrition, and crush him in a single annihilating clash of main forces. The 1930s saw this dream take shape in steel. The Yamato and Musashi, each displacing more than 70,000 tons and mounting the largest naval guns ever built, were meant to guarantee Japan's mastery of the Pacific. Carriers like Akagi and Kaga added reach to that power, while elite pilots in the new Mitsubishi A6M0 promised air superiority few could challenge. That confidence peaked on 7 December 1941, when Japan's carrier strike on Pearl Harbor seemed to prove Mahan right. The United States Pacific Fleet lay crippled, battleships burning in neat lines, and Tokyo's newspapers declared a new era of maritime dominance. Yet the victory carried a hidden flaw. Japan had struck perfectly, but planned poorly for the long war that followed. Within 6 months at Midway, the illusion began to fracture. 4 of Japan's frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, vanished in a single afternoon of exploding fuel lines and burning decks. The loss of their veteran pilots was a wound no doctrine could heal. From that point, the Imperial Navy was fighting a race it could not win. While Japan obsessed over prestige, building massive warships meant to awe, the United States embraced practicality. American shipyards, humming around the clock under Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy, produced hundreds of smaller vessels that required less armor, less crew, and could be built in months instead of years. Among them were the escort carriers nicknamed jeep carriers or baby flattops. With a top speed barely above 19 knots and flight decks less than half the length of a fleet carrier, they looked like awkward compromises. Japanese intelligence dismissed them as floating depots for aircraft ferries or convoy screens, unworthy of serious notice. Yet these unglamorous ships would quietly change the nature of naval warfare. Each could launch Wildcats and Avengers from steel decks laid by civilian hands, providing air cover for supply convoys, amphibious landings, and hunter-killer groups hunting submarines. By 1943, the contrast was complete. Japan's industrial limits meant it could launch perhaps 2 new carriers a year. The US was launching 2 escort carriers a month. The Japanese still worshipped the duel of giants, but the Americans had learned the value of relentless pressure, of replacing losses faster than the enemy could react. It was no longer a war of singular victories, but of endless presence. The Imperial Navy's grand vision of a decisive battle was fading into history, replaced by a swarm of small decks that never seemed to stop sending planes into the sky. Soon, as the seas around the Philippines turned grey with storm and smoke, Japan would learn how these humble carriers could shatter an empire built on pride. Necessity, more than design, birthed the escort carrier. In 1941, as the United States watched its few fleet carriers stretch thin across 2 oceans, the Navy faced a brutal arithmetic. Shipyards could not produce full-sized carriers fast enough to protect the convoys carrying men and machines to distant fronts. The solution was unorthodox: transform merchant and tanker hulls into small mobile airfields. From that compromise emerged the escort carrier, officially designated CVE. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Trade speed and armor for quantity and reach. A steel merchant hull received a wooden flight deck, a small hangar and elevator, and enough space for roughly 24 aircraft. It was naval ingenuity stripped to its essentials, proof that in total war, adequacy delivered faster was more powerful than perfection delivered late. The first of these, the Bogue class, drew its bones from the standard C-3 cargo ship design, a vessel intended to haul freight, not fight. Yet once refitted with a flight deck and conning tower, it could launch Grumman F-4F Wildcats for air defense and TBF Avengers for torpedo or depth charge runs. With a top speed of just 18 knots, powered by diesel engines, it was half as fast as the sleek Essex-class fleet carriers then under construction. But the Navy's planners understood what Japan did not. Speed mattered less than presence. Every convoy escorted by a CVE gained a moving umbrella of protection against submarines and bombers. Every amphibious landing gained eyes and strike power overhead. The genius lay in their producibility. On the US West Coast, Henry Kaiser's shipyards, already famous for building Liberty ships at record pace, applied assembly line methods to carrier construction. Welders and riveters, many of them women, could turn out a seaworthy escort carrier in under 90 days. By mid-1944, more than 100 had been launched, a floating testament to industrial momentum. Their flat decks and minimal armor made them look fragile. But their very simplicity meant repairs were quick and losses affordable. To the Japanese, they were flying boxes, curiosities hardly worth torpedoing compared to the grand fleet carriers. To the Americans, they were lifelines, bridges of steel and plywood stretching from San Diego to the Solomons, from Pearl Harbor to Leyte. And as they began to appear in convoys and island assaults across the Pacific, these humble ships multiplied until they became the invisible spine of Allied strategy. In early 1943, they would begin to show their true worth, appearing where no carrier was thought to exist, rewriting the limits of naval air power, one small deck at a time. May 1943, North Atlantic, 400 miles west of the Azores. The sea boiled grey under low clouds as USS Bogue CVE-9 ploughed eastward, her deck slick with salt spray and aviation fuel. The weather was brutal, the air soaked with diesel fumes from the destroyer escorts screening her flanks. Beneath those waves lurked the deadliest hunters of the war, German U-boats, once the unchallenged predators of the Atlantic. For years, they had picked off convoys with mathematical precision, vanishing before escorting destroyers could respond. But this time the hunters were being hunted. Above the horizon, the deep whine of radial engines announced the new weapon the Kriegsmarine had not yet learned to fear: Grumman TBF Avengers, lumbering from the deck of a ship that was never supposed to exist. The Bogue was the centerpiece of one of the US Navy's first hunter-killer groups, a tactical innovation pairing a slow escort carrier with sonar-equipped destroyer escorts. Her Avengers carried radar sets that could sweep the ocean's skin and depth charges rigged for rapid drops. On May 22, 1943, one of Bogue's patrols picked up the shadow of U-569, a Type 7C submarine cruising at periscope depth. Within minutes, a pair of Avengers descended through the mist, radar scopes glowing. The first depth charges bracketed the swirl of the diving U-boat. The second pass finished it. When oil and debris surfaced, the crew of the Bogue realized they had achieved something extraordinary. A carrier aircraft had sunk a submarine in mid-ocean. Over the next months, U-217, U-355, and several more U-boats met the same fate. By year's end, escort carriers across the Atlantic had helped destroy over 30 German submarines, a toll that broke the back of the once fearsome wolf packs. Radio intercepts from U-boat command reflected disbelief. Reports spoke of aircraft appearing from nowhere, as if the ocean itself had turned hostile. What had been a vast hunting ground for the Kriegsmarine was now an Allied killing field. Patrolled by aircraft launched from ships barely half the size of a cruiser, the success was more than tactical. It was transformative. The presence of a single CVE could now protect convoys stretching hundreds of miles, neutralizing threats once considered unstoppable. For the first time since 1939, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. By late 1943, the Pacific Fleet had taken notice. If these humble baby carriers could purge the Atlantic of submarines, what might they do against Japan's island bastions and long-range raiders? The answer was already forming in the minds of planners at Pearl Harbor, where new escort groups were being readied for the vast battles to come. The ocean had chosen its new masters, and their decks were made of wood. January 1944, Kwajalein Atoll shimmered under the equatorial sun, its palms bent inland from the concussion of naval bombardment. The Pacific, a glassy blue horizon broken only by coral reefs, now carried new shapes, stubby, flat-decked vessels unlike the sleek giants of the U.S. carrier fleet. These were the escort carriers, the humble CVEs that had already proven their worth in the Atlantic and were now entering the Pacific War. Under Task Group 52.1, ships like USS Sangamon, Sewanee, Chenango, and Santee steamed into position for Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Their decks were crowded with Grumman F-6F Hellcats and TBF Avengers, wings folded tight, crews sweating through khaki shirts as they armed bombs and loaded ammunition belts. At dawn, the first engines roared, and within hours the sky over Kwajalein swarmed with American aircraft. Each of these small carriers launched hundreds of sorties daily. Hellcats strafed bunkers and radio towers. Avengers dropped 500-pound bombs on Japanese supply dumps and fuel stores. Spotter planes photographed defenses, guiding amphibious waves toward the beaches, with precision unthinkable just a year earlier. Their shallow draft allowed them to anchor inside lagoons, where the massive Essex-class carriers dared not venture, making them both shield and spear for the invasion fleets. On the islands below, Japanese defenders watched wave after wave of aircraft arrive and vanish, never realizing that many had come from ships scarcely longer than a destroyer escort. One officer on Roy Namur radioed to his superiors in disbelief. "The enemy has endless planes. Even their transports are carriers." By June, during the Marianas Campaign, escort carriers repeated the feat at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, their Avengers hunting submarines, while their fighters shredded coastal strongholds. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. Japan's defenders could no longer tell where the next attack would come from, or how many carriers prowled beyond the mist. The illusion was total. The Pacific seemed filled with floating airfields. In truth, it was not illusion but evolution. The U.S. Navy had learned that air power no longer required leviathans. Dozens of small decks, dispersed yet coordinated, could sustain constant pressure, without risking the capital ships. It was the dawn of decentralized naval aviation, one that made Japan's vast empire feel suddenly small. Soon that same principle would carry the CVEs toward the Philippines, where they would face the enemy head-on and shatter the last faith in Japan's naval supremacy. June 19, 1944, east of Saipan. Dawn broke over a mirror-still Philippine sea as squadrons of the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, prepared for what they believed would be their redemption. Nearly 400 aircraft, Zeros, Judys, and Kates, were poised across decks of carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho, their engines coughing blue smoke into the humid air. For the Japanese, this was to be the decisive blow, the great fleet action that would halt the American advance through the Marianas. The doctrine of the decisive battle, burned into every officer since Tsushima, would at last be fulfilled. But far to the east, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, had already seen them coming. American radar, a silent network of electronic sentinels, picked up Ozawa's formations 150 miles out. Alarms rolled across the task forces as the great Essex-class carriers launched wave after wave of F-6F Hellcats. Among the supporting ships, the smaller escort carriers, USS Kalinin Bay, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, and others, joined the action, launching additional fighters to plug gaps in the air screen and recover damaged planes limping back from the front line. The sky soon filled with contrails twisting into violent spirals. Hellcats climbed into the sun, pouncing on Japanese formations before they ever sighted the fleet. By mid-morning, the battle had turned from contest to slaughter. Japanese pilots, many hastily trained replacements with only a few hours of carrier flight experience, faced disciplined, radar-guided American fighters directed by combat information centers. The Avengers from the CVEs patrolled the edges, dropping depth charges on submarines stalking the task force, while their decks caught the wounded and fuel-starved Hellcats from the fleet carriers. By sunset, over 300 Japanese aircraft lay destroyed, burning across sea and sky. The once elite naval air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor was gone, its veterans lost forever beneath the waves. What staggered Japanese intelligence even more than the defeat itself was what followed. Despite the enormous scale of the battle, the American air effort did not falter. As one Japanese officer later remarked, their carriers breed like factories. Even if the Imperial Navy could sink one, dozens more, large and small, remained to replace it. Tokyo's naval staff called this grim reality mechanized immortality, the notion that America's machines could endlessly reproduce their own power. Ozawa's fleet, shattered and short of fuel, limped back toward Okinawa, its pride extinguished. Ahead, the U.S. fleet sailed westward toward the Philippines, where the next campaign would test whether Japan's courage could withstand not just overwhelming firepower, but the psychological weight of a nation that never seemed to run out of carriers or men. October 25, 1944, off Samar Island. Dawn broke beneath a ceiling of grey rain squalls and rising wind. The sea hissed against the hulls of 6 small ships that formed the heart of Task Unit 77.43, codenamed Taffy 3. These were not fleet carriers or armored cruisers, but fragile escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, each barely armored, their decks crowded with FM-2 Wildcats and TBF Avengers. Their only protection came from a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, Johnston, Hole, Heermann, Samuel B. Roberts, and a few others, thin hulls standing between the slow-moving baby flattops and the open sea. Their mission was simple: provide air support for the landings on Leyte. No one expected a major naval engagement. Then, at Aero 647, a lookout aboard Fanshawe Bay shouted, "Ships!" Battleships bearing west. Through breaks in the rain appeared a nightmare. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 23 heavy units including the monstrous Yamato, Nagato, and Kongo closing fast. The Japanese had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait unseen. On the American decks, disbelief turned to chaos. These escort carriers, barely capable of 18 knots, now faced an onrushing armada whose 18-inch guns could fire shells heavier than an entire Wildcat fighter. Yet panic gave way to action. Flight crews raced to launch every aircraft that could fly. Many Avengers took off carrying only depth charges instead of armor-piercing bombs, but still dove straight into the fight. Strafing bridges and dropping ordnance meant for submarines onto battleships. As shells the size of trucks screamed overhead, the destroyers made their stand. Commander Ernest Evans, aboard USS Johnston, ordered flank speed and charged alone through geysers of shellfire to launch torpedoes against the cruisers. Moments later, USS Hole and Samuel B. Roberts followed, laying smoke screens and drawing fire away from the retreating carriers. The ocean around them erupted in pillars of water and flame, yet the small ships pressed on until their decks were wrecked and their guns silent. Above them, Taffy 3's aircraft harassed the Japanese with relentless fury. Wildcats dived through anti-aircraft bursts to rake gun crews with machine gun fire. Torpedo planes feinted and circled again, giving the illusion of a larger force. Confused by the smoke, radar echoes, and sheer audacity of the defense, Japanese spotters misjudged what they were facing. Reports aboard Yamato spoke of multiple carrier groups in strength attacking from several bearings. To Kurita's bridge officers, it seemed they had stumbled into the heart of the American fleet. By late morning, with ammunition running low and formation in disarray, Kurita lost faith in the engagement. Convinced he faced overwhelming reinforcements, he issued the order to withdraw. The mightiest battleship force Japan had ever assembled turned away from a handful of escort carriers and tin can destroyers. The impossible had happened. 6 wooden-decked baby flattops and their escorts had bluffed, bled and beaten back the core of the Imperial Navy. In the radio rooms of the surviving ships, stunned operators repeated a phrase that would become legend. Taffy 3 still engaging, enemy retreating. That retreat marked not just the end of the battle, but the end of Japan's dream of sea power. Panic rippled from the coast of Samar all the way to Tokyo, where the truth dawned. The Empire's last fleet had been turned back by the smallest carriers in the world. The morning haze over Samar thickened with cordite and rain as the echoes of gunfire faded. On the bridge of Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita stared into a horizon that no longer made sense. Smoke plumes rose in every direction. Radios screamed with contradictory reports, and radar screens flickered with ghosts. One transmission claimed a column of American carriers approaching from the east. Another insisted heavy cruisers were closing from the south. Destroyers, said a third, were attacking from the north. Every voice in the network demanded orders, but none could paint a coherent picture. Japan's vaunted center force, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now fighting shadows born of confusion, exhaustion, and deception. The chaos was not entirely of their making. American coordination, improvised and desperate though it was, had achieved near-perfect illusion. From their wooden decks, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 cycled aircraft with ruthless efficiency, launching, recovering, refueling, and relaunching in continuous rotation. Each small squadron of FM-2 Wildcats and TBF Avengers attacked in waves spaced minutes apart, giving the impression of a massive, unending aerial armada. Japanese pilots, glimpsing new groups appearing through clouds, radioed inflated counts, dozens of carriers, hundreds of aircraft. Primitive Japanese radar, easily confused by sea clutter and weather, confirmed the hallucination. Kurita's officers, poring over incomplete charts, saw every direction as threatened. Then came the hammer blows. Torpedoes from the USS Hirman tore into Chikuma, while explosions aboard Suzuya, triggered by near-miss bombs from Taffy 3's Avengers, sent columns of flame hundreds of feet high. To Kurita, already worn by days of battle and sleepless nights, it appeared that his fleet was collapsing under siege. Witnesses later described the admiral pacing the bridge, uniform damp with sweat, muttering, "The enemy air cannot be counted." For him, the pattern was unmistakable. Japan had been drawn into a trap by an American carrier force of impossible size. When he finally gave the order to withdraw, it was not a tactical calculation, but a psychological surrender. The admiral who had commanded Yamato, the largest warship ever built, was undone not by guns or torpedoes, but by the relentless illusion of industrial abundance. The Imperial Navy's faith in spiritual supremacy, the belief that courage could triumph over machinery, died that morning in the waters off Samar. Behind the retreating fleet, the Pacific rolled black with oil and smoke, and before them loomed a new kind of enemy, one that did not tire, did not falter, and could replace everything it lost. The next chapter of the war would reveal how America had built this unending storm, an industrial miracle that made infinite air a grim reality. The thunder of Leyte Gulf was forged not only in courage, but in industry. Behind every escort carrier that rose from the Pacific spray stood a continent transformed into an engine of war. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 122 escort carriers, a new ship every 9 days. They emerged from shipyards that never slept, where sparks flew against steel in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. At Henry J. Kaiser's yards in California and Washington, welders worked under floodlights through the night, joining prefabricated hull sections built miles apart. Welding replaced riveting, cutting production time by nearly 80%. To the Japanese, each new CVE seemed to appear as if conjured from smoke. To America, they were simply the next number on a list, the next hull to slide into water. This miracle of speed was matched by efficiency. Each escort carrier required only a fraction of the manpower and resources of a fleet carrier, about 500 crewmen and 28 aircraft compared to the Essex-class's 2,600 men and 90 planes. Yet their collective power was staggering. By mid-1944, the Pacific swarmed with task units named Taffy 1, 2, and 3, each its own miniature air force. Grumman's factories on Long Island and General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division in Trenton turned out F-4F Wildcats, and TBF Avengers, faster than Japan, could replace a single lost squadron. It was production as warfare, steel, oil, and labor marshaled into rhythm until output itself became a weapon. While Japanese shipyards struggled under bombings, shortages, and the loss of skilled craftsmen, the U.S. industrial machine reached self-perpetuating momentum. Tankers, transports, and escort carriers moved from blueprint to sea in weeks, while every ship lost was replaced before the enemy even recorded the sinking. Numbers became strategy. Where one carrier could not win, 10 could smother. The escort carrier, small, spare, efficient, became the perfect embodiment of industrial democracy at war. A vessel that ordinary Americans could build. Crew and command. By the war's final year, the Pacific was dotted with them, their decks bristling with planes, their wakes crisscrossing thousands of miles of ocean. They turned the abstract might of factories and assembly lines into something living. A storm of machines guided by men who had once been mechanics, farmers, and factory workers themselves. The Japanese called it mechanized immortality, but to the Americans who built it, it was simply proof that quantity, when guided by resolve, could become its own kind of quality. The next section explores how this new scale of abundance reshaped not just logistics, but the psychology of war itself. By the closing months of 1944, the escort carriers had perfected a doctrine that turned endurance into a weapon. Where Japan had once sought decisive strikes, the U.S. Navy had learned the science of continuous assault. Each CVE operated as part of a synchronized system, one squadron in the air, another refueling, a third rearming below deck. Operations manuals mandated 15-minute turnaround times, and on well-drilled ships even that seemed leisurely. The flight decks never rested. Engines coughed, catapults clanged, and ordnance crews worked knee-deep in spent casings and bomb fins. To the enemy, the result felt supernatural, raids that began at dawn and never truly ended. When one wave of Avengers or Hellcats vanished beyond the horizon, another appeared as if conjured from the clouds. For the Japanese soldiers pinned on the beaches of Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, this rhythm became a living nightmare. Survivors later recalled airplanes that never left the sky, the steady drone of engines rising and falling like a tide. Even as smoke choked the air and the ground trembled under bombardment, the sound remained, a mechanical heartbeat that announced an empire's slow death. Strategically, the CVEs extended the concept of the air umbrella far beyond the reach of fleet carriers. They could hover over landing zones, guard supply convoys, or patrol hundreds of miles of open ocean. For commanders, it meant simultaneous invasions across islands once thought unreachable. For Japan, it meant there was no sanctuary left in the Pacific. Their weakness, speed, and armor proved irrelevant against the sheer weight of numbers. When USS St. Lo was struck at Leyte by one of the first kamikaze aircraft, flames tore through her deck, and her magazines erupted in a thunderclap that lifted her bow from the water. Yet before the smoke cleared, planes from Kalinin Bay and White Plains were already airborne, covering the gap as though the loss had never occurred. In that moment, America had weaponized persistence itself. No matter how many ships were sunk, the formation never seemed to thin. The sound of aircraft never seemed to stop. To Japanese commanders, this was more than defeat. It was revelation. The enemy they faced could fight without pause, because his factories, manuals, and men were all part of the same machine. The battlefront had merged with the assembly line, and attrition had become strategy. The next section would explore the human toll of this transformation, how Japan's warriors, raised on the creed of spirit and sacrifice, now faced an opponent whose power was measured not in courage, but in endless mechanical inevitability. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had become more than a clash of fleets. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of existence. The Imperial Japanese Navy, founded on the code of Bushido, believed that courage, honor, and sacrifice could outweigh material inferiority. Battleships like Yamato and Musashi had been built as spiritual monuments as much as weapons, embodiments of faith in the warrior's will. But against America's escort carriers, that faith began to collapse. These ships were not monuments. They were machines, repeatable, replaceable, and utterly without sentiment. Each CVE symbolized an idea the Japanese could not reconcile, that victory no longer required heroism, only organization. On the bridge of Yamato, surviving officers recorded a growing sense of futility. "Even if we kill one, 10 more come," one pilot wrote in his log, watching the endless formations of Wildcats and Avengers orbiting the gray sky. The rhythm of American warfare, launch, refuel, rearm, repeat, was mechanical perfection, immune to exhaustion or doubt. Every Japanese sortie seemed swallowed by an opponent that felt not human but industrial. Morale, once the Imperial Navy's hidden weapon, withered beneath that realization. Courage could destroy a ship. It could not destroy a system. For the Americans, the escort carriers were emblems of collective strength. No single captain or ace defined their victories. It was the synergy of crewmen, engineers, and assembly lines that carried the day. They were the embodiment of democracy in motion, every man a part of the greater machine. To Japan, this was incomprehensible and unbearable. Out of that despair was born the kamikaze, an attempt to turn death itself into a weapon, to prove that the human spirit could still wound the machine. Yet even this defiance failed. For every St. Lo consumed in fire, another ship steamed in behind it, her deck already launching new planes. The myth of invincible spirit drowned beneath the hum of engines that never stopped. In those final months, as Japan's seas burned and its skies filled with contrails, the truth settled like ash. The age of the warrior had ended, and the age of the machine had begun. The next section would trace how these unglamorous escort carriers, born as wartime improvisations, became the blueprint for the new global air power that would define the modern world. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the oceans that had once roared with battle now reflected the silhouettes of hundreds of small, flat-decked ships lying at anchor, the escort carriers, or baby flattops that had changed the nature of naval warfare. Most would soon be decommissioned, sold for scrap, or repurposed as aircraft ferries and training vessels, yet their influence outlived their steel. From these humble decks emerged the blueprint of the modern Navy, one built not on grandeur, but on flexibility. The lessons of the CVE became doctrine. The idea that small, rapidly built vessels could project air power anywhere inspired the creation of helicopter carriers, amphibious assault ships, and light carriers that would serve across Korea, Vietnam, and into the 21st century. The logic was unassailable. Control of the skies no longer required massive, vulnerable flagships. It required many ships, each capable of sustaining its own pocket of power. During the Cold War, this philosophy evolved into the backbone of anti-submarine warfare strategy. Convoys in the North Atlantic and the Pacific were guarded by carriers modeled on the CVE, their aircraft scanning the depths for Soviet submarines just as Avengers once hunted U-boats. The escort carrier had proven that command of the sea began with command of the air, no matter how small the platform, but perhaps their most enduring impact lay in psychology. Before the war, naval supremacy had been measured in tonnage and gun caliber. After the CVEs, it was measured in adaptability and coordination. Japanese historians later acknowledged that their nation's greatest strategic failure was not technological, but conceptual, the inability to recognize the threat posed by ships that looked too small to matter. In contrast, the U.S. Naval War College made the tale of Taffy 3 required reading, a study in courage, deception, and improvisation under fire. The escort carriers had taught a profound truth, that innovation and morale could outfight power and prestige. As navies entered the jet age, their spirit endured in every compact deck that launched an aircraft into battle. From the wooden decks of the Gambier Bay to the steel flat-tops of modern amphibious groups, the lineage remained unbroken. The final echo of their legacy returns to that grey morning off Leyte Gulf, when a handful of small ships stood against the might of an empire, and in doing so, quietly redefined what victory at sea would mean for the rest of history. As the last salvos faded over Samar, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood amid a world of drifting smoke and ruin. The sea around Yamato was scarred with oil slicks and burning wreckage, fragments of his shattered fleet, and the ghostly remnants of an empire's ambition. In the distance, faint and steady, came the sound that had broken Japan's spirit, the drone of aircraft engines rising again from somewhere beyond the horizon. He could not see them, but he knew they were coming, new waves, new machines summoned from the endless depth of American industry. For the first time, Japan's admirals understood that this war could no longer be won through strategy or valor. It was a war of momentum, and the enemy's momentum was infinite. The escort carriers, once dismissed as curiosities, had rewritten the arithmetic of battle. They turned the ocean into a vast production line, each wooden deck a factory of death and endurance. America had conquered not only distance but fatigue. Even when ships burned, new ones appeared. Even when squadrons fell, replacements took off before the wreckage cooled. Against such a system, Japan's courage could only shatter itself. The decisive battle that its navy had dreamed of for a generation had come, and it had been lost not to greater guns, but to greater persistence. In that realization lay the empire's true defeat. The sound of those engines became the anthem of its ending, a mechanical heartbeat that outlasted faith, pride, and flesh. Long after the flames died, survivors of the Imperial Navy remembered not the shells or torpedoes, but that unending hum, the voice of the smallest ships that had cast the longest shadow in history.